Imagine an invisible wall, a barrier so mysterious that no creature can pass through it. Not man, not bird, not even the sea itself. On one side of this barrier, life evolves in one direction, and on the other, an entirely different world unfolds. A divide so precise it seems almost supernatural. But this isn't fiction. This invisible line exists, and it lies between two small islands in Indonesia, Bali and Lombok, separated by just 35 kilometers of ocean, and yet divided by millions of years of evolution. The creatures on one island, tigers, rhinos, elephants, belong to Asia. Across the narrow sea, just a few miles away, you'll find marsupials, monitor lizards, and kangaroos, animals of Australia. Even the birds who could so easily cross the strait never do. It's as if nature herself drew a boundary, a silent, unseen wall, a line now known to science as the Wallace Line. And the man who discovered it was not a famous academic, not a wealthy explorer, but a poor, self-taught naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace. Scene 1. The Boy Who Read Maps. Alfred Wallace was born in 1823 in a small town in Wales to a family too poor to afford his schooling. By the age of 6, he had to drop out of school entirely, but he never stopped learning. His father was a land surveyor, a man who made maps, and their small home was filled with old charts and books on gardening, geography, and the natural world. Night after night, young Alfred would pore over them by candlelight. He didn't yet know it, but those maps of rivers, mountains, and forests would one day lead him to draw a line of his own, a line that would rewrite how humanity understood life itself. But before that could happen, life would test him over and over again. Scene 2. Failure, friendship, and a plan. When Wallace was still a young man, his father died, and the family fell into hardship. To survive, Alfred joined his brother in the family's small surveying business. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him to read the land, to see how geography shaped everything that lived upon it. Then came a turning point. Wallace met a man named Henry Walter Bates, an entomologist, a collector of beetles and butterflies. Their meeting changed everything. Bates showed Wallace how rare insects and animal specimens were being sold to collectors across Victorian England for a small fortune. To a man with no money and a restless mind, this was more than a business. It was a way to explore the world. In 1848, the two friends set sail for Brazil. For 4 years, they trekked through the Amazon rainforest, collecting strange birds, dazzling butterflies, and species no one in Europe had ever seen before. Wallace believed he was on the verge of fame, until, on his voyage home, tragedy struck. His ship caught fire in the middle of the Atlantic. Everything, his notes, his collections, his years of work, was lost to the sea. He barely survived, and yet from the ashes of that disaster rose an even greater journey. Scene 3. Toward the Edge of the World. In 1854, Wallace sailed again, this time toward the islands of the Malay archipelago, what we now call Indonesia. It was a world of volcanoes and coral seas, a place where Asia and Australia met and blurred. For the next 8 years, Wallace would live among these islands, enduring disease, storms, and hunger, driven only by a question that haunted him. Why did life take different forms in different places? He began in Singapore, then moved to the lush island of Bali. There he cataloged tigers, elephants, woodpeckers, species clearly connected to Asia. But then he crossed the narrow Lombok Strait to the nearby island of Lombok, just 35 kilometers east. And what he found there defied everything he knew. The forests were alive with kangaroo-like marsupials, bright birds of paradise, and monitor lizards. No elephants, no tigers, no rhinos. It was as though he had stepped through a portal, from one continent to another. Wallace wrote in his journal that it felt as if a great invisible wall divided the two worlds. Even the birds who could have flown easily across the sea did not cross, nor did the fish or turtles beneath the waves. Something unseen was stopping them. Scene 4. The Line of Life. As weeks turned into months, Wallace began to piece together what he was seeing. He realized that these islands weren't just random patches of land. They were fragments of two ancient continents, Asia to the west and Australia to the east. Long ago, they had been connected to those mainlands. But when the Ice Age ended, the rising seas flooded the low-lying regions between them, cutting off animal populations on either side. Over millions of years, they evolved in complete isolation. That invisible wall, the line between Bali and Lombok, wasn't magic. It was evolution written in geography. He called it the Line of the Archipelago. Later, it would be named after him, the Wallace Line, but the world would not believe him, not yet, because at that time, the idea that species changed, that life could evolve, was considered heresy. Scene 5, the fever and the revelation. Then came another turning point. While traveling through the jungles of the Moluccan Islands, Wallace caught malaria. He fell into a fever so intense he hovered between life and death for days. And in that delirium, he saw it dash, the missing piece to the mystery of life. He realized that species changed, not by random chance, but by natural selection. The strongest survived, the weakest faded away. Over time, each generation carried forward the traits. That helped it endure. Nature itself was the great editor of life. When he recovered, he wrote down this revolutionary idea in a letter and sent it to the only man he thought would understand, Charles Darwin. Scene 6, the Great Betrayal. Darwin had been working in secret on a similar theory for nearly 20 years. When Wallace's letter arrived, he was stunned and terrified. If he didn't publish soon, history might remember Wallace as the true discoverer of evolution. So Darwin acted fast. He presented both his and Wallace's findings at the Linnean Society in London in 1858, without Wallace even present. And 1 year later, Darwin published The Origin of Species, a book that would forever change science. But in its pages, the name Alfred Russel Wallace was barely mentioned. The world crowned Darwin, the father of evolutionary biology. And Wallace, he faded quietly into history, forgotten by the very science he helped create. Scene 7, the proof that came too late. Years passed. Wallace grew old, poor, and uncelebrated. But his ideas about that invisible line dividing life refused to die. In the mid-20th century, geologists finally discovered something that would vindicate him completely: plate tectonics. They found that the Earth's crust was not fixed, but made of giant plates that moved slowly over time. Mountains rose, seas formed, continents drifted apart, and the region Wallace had explored, the islands between Asia and Australia, lay directly on one of these tectonic boundaries. Bali had once been connected to Asia, Lombok to Australia. The deep sea trench between them was so powerful, its underwater currents prevented even fish and coral from crossing. What Wallace had called a spiritual boundary was in truth a line of geological and evolutionary destiny. He had been right, 100 years before science could prove it. Scene 8, the forgotten genius. But Wallace never knew. He died in 1913 at the age of 90, a man of quiet brilliance and even quieter recognition. Today we call it the Wallace Line, but few remember the man himself, a man who, with no university degree, no money, and no laboratory, mapped the invisible borders of life on Earth. He was more than a scientist. He was a poet of nature, someone who saw patterns not with instruments, but with wonder. His story reminds us that truth often arrives before its time, and that the world doesn't always celebrate the minds that change it. Scene 9, the cost of discovery. There's a strange kind of tragedy that follows the great thinkers of history. They see the world as it truly is, long before others can. And because of that, they're often ignored, doubted, even stolen from. Alfred Wallace was not alone. There have been many like him, scientists whose discoveries reshaped our world, but whose names faded into the margins. It happened to the Indian physicist Narendra Singh Kapani, whose invention of fiber optics laid the foundation for the internet itself. And yet the Nobel Prize was given elsewhere. It happened to countless others, the silent architects of modern reality. But perhaps the greatest injustice is not that they were forgotten, but that we almost forgot to wonder the way they did. Scene 10. The line within us. The Wallace Line still exists. It runs invisibly through the Indonesian seas, a reminder that life, like the Earth itself, is divided and connected at once. But maybe there's another invisible line, one that runs through us, between curiosity and comfort, between knowing and seeking, between those who accept the world as it is and those who dare to ask why it's that way at all. Alfred Russel Wallace crossed that line. He looked at the same forests, the same skies, the same maps, and saw something no one else did. He saw the story of life written not in books, but in the flight of a bird, the scales of a lizard, and the silence between two islands. That is the mark of a true explorer. Not one who travels the farthest, but one who sees the deepest. So the next time you look at a map, remember, some boundaries are drawn by nations, but others by nature herself. And somewhere beyond the horizon, an invisible line still holds its secret, waiting for another curious mind to find it, because the world is still full of invisible lines, and discovery always begins with a question.